Armored Core 6 is fantastic. I'm officially a fan. And in fact, I'm such a fan that I've played through the entire game 3 times already. AC6 is an explosive power fantasy of bullets, missiles, and laser swords. It's a complete and utter spectacle of fast-paced mech combat unlike anything I've ever played. It's just really good. And in a year so stacked with big releases, this one deserves your attention too. However, despite all my praise, I want to be careful not to set expectations too high, because I still have some mixed feelings, and I still think some people won't necessarily click with this game as much as I did. Unlike a game like Elden Ring, I wouldn't be surprised to see some reviewers not be in love with it. This is the type of game I expect IGN to give like an 8, you know? It simply doesn't have that same sort of universal appeal and won't come even close to Elden Ring's sales. What I just said isn't a critique, by the way, simply an observation and guess at how things will play out. So before you go running off to buy it, let's talk about it. As I mentioned in my preview video, I didn't grow up playing Armored Core. Instead, Demon's Souls was my introduction to From Software in 2009. And if you aren't familiar with my channel, I think From Software makes some cool stuff. When AC6 was announced, I deliberately chose to not play all of the old games in the series. I did this so that I could provide a more relatable perspective to everyone watching, and that's the perspective of someone who hasn't touched Armored Core, but who's still a FromSoft fan thanks to one or more of their Soulsborne Kiro Ring games. I'm willing to bet the overwhelming majority of you who are interested in this game share that perspective. First, AC6 is not a Souls-like. It plays very, very differently from the Souls series, and at best has a couple Souls-adjacent elements, like, for example, challenging boss fights that revolve around you learning a set of big telegraphed attacks one failed attempt at a time. What is this game then? Well, it's a third-person mech action game about piloting a highly customizable mech. You go on missions, you earn money, and then you spend that money to purchase a wide variety of parts for your mech. Most missions are relatively bite-sized and see you completing 1 or 2 objectives, and those objectives pretty much always involve you blowing something up. And the whole time, a story unfolds in the background as you, a mercenary mech pilot, get hired by different groups and corporations on the planet of Rubicon 3, a planet with a mysterious past and a turbulent present. Now, let's get into why this game is actually good. The gameplay. If you want a complete breakdown of the controls, check out my preview video from last month. But as a brief overview, you control a mech equipped with 4 weapons simultaneously that each shoot at enemies. This is facilitated by a lock-on system that targets whatever is closest to the center of your screen, and it can be toggled to a more traditional hard lock-on like something you'd see in a Souls game. You can ascend into the air by flying, use quick boosts to avoid attacks, and use an assault boost to close gaps and be aggressive. These actions all require energy, which is basically just a stamina bar that refills whenever you're on the ground. Your weapon choices matter a lot because different weapons are effective at different ranges, so combat becomes a dance of constantly moving, dodging, and flying as you do your best to keep your target at the most effective distance. I found myself really drawn to the close range stuff, and one of my favorite combos was a melee weapon paired with a shotgun, and then 2 laser cannons or grenade launchers on my back. You can unlock some truly over-the-top weapons. Small enemies go down quick, but other ACs and bosses are where the gameplay really shines. Here, it's not just about dealing damage, it's about filling up their stagger bars to then follow up with big attacks when they're in a staggered state. All weapons have different impact values, which is what determines how easily you can stagger an enemy. So a key part of decision making when choosing weapons should be focused on making sure you can build up that stagger bar properly. It's also good to remember that you have a whole extra dimension to play with in the form of jumping and flying over enemies. This can be critical in avoiding attacks and landing your own, and it's the biggest thing I think new players might forget to do when they're starting out. The boss fights and mech duels are where this game really clicked for me. Bear with me for a minute, I promise this is relevant, but let's look at a boss fight in Elden Ring real quick. It's you versus the boss. You watch the boss closely for telegraphed attacks, you dodge those attacks, then you find openings between attacks to damage the boss yourself. And then you need to do all of this while managing your stamina. This is essentially how every fight goes. It's great, it's fun. However, here's why Armored Core 6 feels so fresh to me. Combat has all of those same elements, but with several additional layers of complexity on top. You're not just avoiding telegraphed attacks, you're also constantly managing your distance from the enemy with specific ranges to make the best use of your weapons. And you're not just doing that on a flat 2D plane, you're also flying through the air and taking advantage of the third dimension. You're not just attacking the boss with a single weapon, you're using 4 weapons simultaneously. And you're not just mindlessly firing those weapons, you're managing their ammo count, reload time, cooldown speed, and hell, even their overheat gauge. You're not just attacking to lower their health, you're also attacking to deal impact damage so you can stagger them. And these staggers are not just opportunities to press a button for a critical hit. They're small windows where you yourself need to deal damage based on what you have equipped, what range you're at, and what's on cooldown. Every second counts. And there's still more, but am I starting to paint a picture here? Coming off the heels of stamina-based Souls-likes, this experience of having to juggle so many different things and make split-second decisions was incredibly refreshing. It's fun. It works. Although part of my hesitation at the start of this video is rooted in knowing that some people simply won't want to deal with all of this, because on some level you do need to engage with all the systems in this game to have fun and make progress. And I realize this description can sound overwhelming or intimidating, and it can be at first, but trust me when I say it's not nearly as crazy as it seems, and I do think you'll get it after only a couple hours, just like I did. By the end of the game, I wasn't even thinking about the controls. I would just see what I had to do and execute. And while difficulty is subjective, this is absolutely the type of game where you can make fights pretty easy if you go in with the right setup. Just don't be scared. This game isn't actually unapproachable by any means, and it's clear FromSoft has made a huge effort to make things accessible. At the end of the day though, this is a game about doing rad shit. It's about dual-wielding Gatling guns while you have giant lasers strapped to your back, or using wacky stuff like a plasma ninja shuriken whip. It's about the spectacle and the explosions and the audio-visual extravaganza of it all, and these fun combat mechanics help facilitate that. And you can listen to me ramble and watch footage of this game all you want, but until you feel the game for yourself, you won't truly get it. AC6 provides a sort of rush from its moment-to-moment gameplay that not many games reach, and simply piloting your mech is an incredibly memorable experience. Now, let's briefly discuss the customization, because that's the other central part of this game, and also where I think it's possible to play in a way that's wrong. I'll elaborate on what I mean by that in a minute. In between missions, you have 11 different slots to equip weapons and change out your mech parts. Again, refer to the previous video if you want a more step-by-step breakdown, but basically there are a lot of choices here, and you can really go down a rabbit hole of fine-tuning the exact loadout you want. And as long as you stay within your weight and energy limits, you can use whatever you want. Aside from weapon choice, the biggest thing you can customize are the legs on your mech. You got standard bipedal, reverse joint, tetrapod, and tank legs. These all have a huge impact on your mobility. For example, reverse joint gets these extra long jumps when quick boosting, as well as high jumps off the ground, and tetrapods can hover in the air for a low energy cost and fire the really big weapons without needing to slow down. The bottom line is that legs can change up the game significantly. Now, why did I say it's possible to play the game wrong here? Basically, I think such a huge part of the enjoyment in this game comes from experimenting with all the different options you're provided with. There truly is an impressive amount of variety when it comes to playstyles, and stuff like your weapon choices change the entire feel of the game. And I think it's possible to miss out on some of this. You might either find something that works and just never change it up, or you might look up a guide on YouTube and equip the most overpowered setup. This would be a mistake, and you'd be robbing yourself of what could have been a more enjoyable experience. Some of my most memorable encounters in the game were when I get to a new boss, get demolished, and then tinker with my setup each subsequent attempt. There's immense satisfaction to be had from clearing something with a setup that's uniquely yours. And the more you experiment with different weapons and mech parts, the more you hold on to that feeling. So yeah, just remember to take advantage of everything the game has to offer, and resist the temptation of looking up the best setups, at least on your first playthrough. Every single thing you can buy can be refunded for 100% of your money back at any time, so go nuts and don't hold back. Now, let's go over how missions are handled. Typically, you're given a straightforward objective marker, and then you just fly off to do it. As a machine of death and destruction, you can probably guess that these objectives usually involve blowing something up. In terms of length, some missions are super quick and only take a couple minutes, though most missions fall somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes. Keep in mind, these times I'm giving you assume you beat them first try, and that will very much not be the case on the tougher ones with bosses. Several of them really push me to figure out the best approach. There's also arena missions, which are quick one-on-one duels against other ACs. In my previous video, I said you're not here to explore. You get in and you get out. And while that is true for a lot of missions, it's not entirely true for all of them. Sometimes you get these longer ones with large environments and a handful of things to find. The 3 categories of collectibles are wrecked ACs that you can scan for data logs, which contain bits of lore, optional enemies that drop combat logs that unlock special parts when you get enough, and the occasional part containers that contain mech parts as well as weapons. So yes, the large missions do have some level of optional exploration, but I don't want to give the wrong impression here. These levels are still very linear and smaller than they seem, with lots of empty space. Here's an expertly drawn diagram to help explain what I mean. There's always a clear critical path to follow with invisible walls along the way, and the bonus stuff comes in the form of short detours to the side. I think this is fun and works well for what this game is going for, but don't expect anything too crazy in terms of exploration, since that's not really the focus. That being said, don't skip out on exploring the big levels. In classic FromSoft fashion, some really cool stuff like secret powerful weapons are hidden and missable. If nothing else, I think these missions succeed in offering consistent variety. You will rarely do the same thing more than once. For example, there's a stealth mission. That is the one stealth mission. There's also an escort mission. That is the one escort mission. Bosses also feel very distinct from one another with their own tricks and gimmicks. All of this goes a long way to keep the game from getting repetitive, and I think that's key to making a game like this work. On top of that, beginning in Chapter 3, you start to be presented with decisions in the form of deciding which mission to select between two choices. This only happens a handful of times, but these choices result in entirely different missions with story consequences as well. You'll miss out on a good chunk of content if you only play through the game once. Speaking of story consequences, I want to make a quick aside about the story of AC6. And don't worry, I won't go into any specifics or spoilers. I really enjoyed it. The characters and voice acting performances were consistently entertaining, and I was invested in the lore and history of this world in a way I didn't expect to be. Most of it is presented through pre- and post-mission audio messages alongside radio chatter during the missions themselves. And it's incredibly interesting to see this hyper-militarized society run by military corporations who are all fighting amongst themselves. You'll get hired by one corporation to attack the base of another, and then the very next mission will see that corporation you just attacked hiring you to strike back at the original ones because, hey, you're a mercenary after all. It's great and borders on parody at times. When the story gets going, those climaxes really climax, you know? And don't worry, this is a story you'll be able to easily follow without 10 supplemental YouTube lore videos, so that'll be a nice change of pace for you Souls fans. Now, let's talk about the big question that's going to be divisive for some people. How long is this game? It's a little complicated, but the quick answer is that it's shorter than some people might expect. I think my first playthrough took about 12 hours, and that consisted of 37 story missions and 29 arena missions. Keep in mind, I tend to finish games faster than most people, so I think something in the 15 to 20 hour range might be more accurate for most people. It all depends on how much you struggle and how much you take your time with customizing. So that does sound kind of short, and I know some people may be disappointed after hearing that number. I was even feeling that myself at first. But it's not the whole story. This is a game that practically begs to be replayed, and that's for several reasons. First, you have the branching path missions that occur during chapters 3, 4, and 5 that offer new gameplay and new story. Second, it's entirely possible to play through the game without touching 90% of the customization options, so a second playthrough is the perfect chance to experiment with stuff you never got around to. You'll also continue unlocking new mech parts and weapons during New Game Plus that weren't available during your first playthrough. Next, and this is a big one, New Game Plus adds missions that weren't even options during your first playthrough. In other words, this isn't including the branching path missions of chapters 3, 4, and 5. I won't go into specifics for spoiler reasons, but you'll be presented with alternate versions of some missions as early as chapters 1 and 2. These new missions are usually harder to compensate for you being experienced at the game and having better equipment. They also affect the story and provide new insight into the world and characters, so this is pretty notable if you care about the story of the game like I did. You also get a few extra arena missions too. Lastly, and this one really shocked me, this all continues into New Game Plus 2, so a third playthrough. You'll get a handful of extra missions, story beats, and unlocks not available in the first two playthroughs. This is awesome, and exactly what I want to see from games with New Game Plus options. Like, as much as I love FromSoft, I've always been disappointed that the idea of changing things in New Game Plus was only really explored in Dark Souls 2. I would have loved to see other Souls games experiment with it, so it's great we get to see an even more fleshed out version of that here in AC6. Bottom line is, yes, this game is on the shorter side if you're a one and done kind of person, but you'll be missing out on a fair bit if that's how you do it. And it's clear this game was designed to be replayed. Those 37 missions for one playthrough are actually closer to somewhere in the mid-50s when you account for all the extra stuff. And while I didn't get a chance to play it yet, PvP is a whole extra layer of content that I can see people messing around with for hours on end. So that's worth keeping in mind if you're really focused on money spent to hours played ratios. Moving on, I want to discuss some of my mixed feelings about the game, and points where I anticipate other people maybe not clicking with it. First, while I love the combat and all of its mechanics, this game is kind of all over the place in terms of difficulty. And I'm not talking about the difficulty that results from your customization options. Like, I love the boss fights and big set piece moments, but chunks of the game where you're just fighting the smaller enemies rarely pushed me, and as a result, I was less engaged by them. This one is tough for me to nail down because I don't know what the solution should have been. A lot of this is a consequence of the game's structure and giving frequent checkpoints with no penalty for dying, so there's really no incentive for worrying about taking damage outside of boss fights in most missions. Like, sure, there's repair costs, but money is simply not an issue when the game gives huge payouts and you can sell everything back at a 100% refund. As a result, chunks of this game can feel too easy, but like I said, I don't know what the solution should have been because the alternative of having no checkpoints could have made the longer missions too tedious. What I'm trying to say is that I wish the difficulty was handled a bit differently, and I wish the non-boss sections were more engaging. The good news is that if you share my feelings about difficulty, there still is an additional challenge to be had in the form of replaying missions for S ranks. Here, you'll be ranked based on time, damage taken, and ammunition costs, and while these seem to be purely optional and just for trophies or bragging rights, they do help provide a much needed layer of challenge for the easier missions. The second thing I was slightly disappointed by was the scope of the game, for lack of a better word. It kind of ties in with the length, but not exactly. Basically, I just wanted more of the big levels with huge 3D environments and little secrets to find, and I wanted more big set piece moments. For example, the desert excavator level was such a blast in Chapter 1 with how you're mounting the giant machine and you have to navigate around it while destroying enemies and avoiding laser blasts. This is the type of mission I wanted to see more of. There's a bunch of smaller and shorter levels, and a lot of these reuse environments from earlier missions. And while I enjoyed these, found them fun, and thought they did a good job of maintaining variety throughout the entire game, I would have felt a lot better about them had there been just a bit more of the bigger ones. All of this is a long way of saying, I just wanted a little more. I hope I don't sound too negative here. My goal is not to nitpick or dissuade you from playing, but rather to just be as honest as possible while also attempting to explain what I anticipate to be slightly more mixed reactions than your typical FromSoft game. But fuck man, when this game is good, it's really good. There are just so many fun and satisfying moments. Here's my mic audio after I beat one of the final bosses in the game. Oh. Yes! Oh my fucking god! Dude, I peaked my mic when I wasn't even planning to record audio. That's how excited I was. I couldn't hold it in. Those are the types of feelings this game can evoke, and FromSoft is really the master of their craft when it comes to that. I honestly wasn't sure if this game would be for me. As a person who's more drawn to fantasy settings, mech games had never really appealed to me. But I'm so glad I took the time to experience this one because it really is something special and unique and unlike anything I've ever played. This game is just cool. I don't know what else to say. So with that in mind, I really hope this is just the beginning of Armored Core making a comeback. This is an incredible foundation that I want to see expanded upon. And I know it won't get even close to the number of sales of something like Elden Ring, but I hope people still give it a shot and try something outside of their comfort zone. I promise you, Baldur's Gate 3 will still be waiting for you when you get back. Thanks for watching, and if you get the game for yourself, I hope you have as much fun as I did.